Hello, so I want to show you some quick pictures regarding this generation. They kind of reflect, again, this kind of culture of change that they're going through and address how Mexican Americans are becoming much more Americanized during this period. So you see in these pictures that they begin to, work here in the United States. Here you have some working at a barber shop in East Los Angeles. They are playing American sports. Here you see a team playing baseball, and you can see some of the fashion. Kind of interesting to see how these women dress in this picture. Here's just another picture of Mexican Americans on the beach. This is all in Los Angeles. And then a few kind of, again, youth in the 1920s, and their fashion really reflects the fashion of the United States at this particular moment. So just wanted to expose you to some of the pictures of this generation. So let's continue. How is this generation changing? So as I mentioned earlier, the period between 1900 and 1920s is when their parents begin to come to the United States, and they come throughout the entire 20-year period, but they also begin to have kids. This is one of the first times where we see the word Chicano actually come up. The word Chicano during the 19-teens and 1920s has a very negative connotation. It's like calling somebody a pocho, which is like a fake Mexican, basically. Later on in the 1960s, it has a different meaning. But in the 19-teens, 1920s, it almost meant like you were half a Mexican. So Mexicano or Mexicano. Their parents were kind of used this as a derogatory remark towards their children because they didn't see them as full Mexicans like they were. So part of it has to do because they're living in the United States, right? They grow up in the United States. Like many of you who are Mexican American, you are partaking in American culture. And back then it's no different. Mexican Americans are listening to the radio. About a third of them own radios, and at this time there's not many Mexican stations, so most of them are listening to American stations, right? American songs. One of the biggest myths that we see is that Mexicans don't want to learn English. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth. And even in the 1920s, we find that Mexican Americans were buying records to teach them English. So they know they live in the United States. They know they have to somehow learn elements of the culture, so they do pick up records to help them learn some of the language. We find that American corporations begin to target this generation, and the article actually mentions this, right, where companies like Max Factor and other department stores begin to focus on this new youth generation. They're like in their teens and 20s that have money to spend, so they are consuming American culture by buying the clothes or the food, right, the cosmetics. They're going to movie houses at this time. So this is, again, a very transitional period where you go from the silent era to the talkies. So they're going to American films, though there are Mexican film houses at this time too. But they're spending money, right? This is a generation that is consuming America in different ways. And we find that dance halls begin to cater to Mexican Americans. They're playing Mexican music, both something like rancheras and corridos, but then Mexican American youth are also going to listen, particularly in downtown Los Angeles, to listen to jazz. So they're leaving the barrio and entering, to some extent, a different culture, right? American culture in downtown Los Angeles. This is an interesting picture right here. This boxer, this is Anglo-American, but over here, his name is Joe Rivers, and what you can kind of see in this picture is, again, that kind of transition that they're going through where his real name is Jose Rios, but because he's living in the United States and began to Americanize his name, and he takes the name Joe Rivers. So it just shows you that this generation that you read about and that I'm talking about here is going through that kind of identity change. And for Mexican Americans, it's a little bit more complicated because Mexico's always right there. With other groups such as Italian Americans or Irish Americans, you don't see it as strong because Ireland's so far away, and Italy is even further. Whereas for us, Mexico is literally right across the border. So Mexican Americans are working. Many of them are going at this time. It's quite easy to become a U.S. citizen. They're going through the naturalization process. So you just had to take some courses. It wasn't that expensive. But they're also working at this period, right? We find that most of them are doing blue-collar jobs, but we do begin to see a group that are becoming that are entering white-collar jobs or professional jobs. You have teachers, you have lawyers, and then you have people working at department stores. So they're entering these jobs that are not considered quote-unquote dirty jobs. And we find that they're begin to buy homes, particularly by the later teens and into the 1920s. They buy a house, and that's why I show you this picture here. Because once you buy a house, particularly back then, it kind of signifies that you kind of gave up on that Mexican dream and that you're going to settle roots on this side of the border. You have a family, you have a wife, you begin to have kids, and that makes it a lot more difficult just to pick up and leave. And they're also buying large durable goods, ice boxes and cars and furniture. So it makes it a lot harder for them just to leave, going back to Mexico. A lot of times, they meet their partner on this side of the border, not in Mexico, but on this side of the border. So they might be from, say, Guadalajara, but their wife is from Sonora. So, where do you go back home to, right? Because those are two different parts of Mexico. So many of them just settle here. And again, like I said, they have kids, and it makes it that much more difficult to leave.